made a huge impact on my own life. I think of it in terms of a turning point, not just in the life of a man, but a turning point in my own life when I finished reading it. One of my great heroes, not doctrinally, but as a man who was so gifted with the pen, was a man called Malcolm Muggeridge, probably the greatest English journalist of the 20th century. I remember spending time with him a little while before he died in 1990, and he told me, when I stand before my Lord, the thing I'm really going to have to ask him for forgiveness for is for being so fatally fluent. He used his pen to advantage, to mockery. But he was teaching journalism in India. And early one morning he came out of his place in his professor's quarters, and he started walking by the river there in the south where he lived. And he got into the river to have his morning bath. And way out in the distance, he saw an Indian woman enter the river in order to have her own morning bath. Muggeridge lived a very sensually driven life. And being a foreigner, he thought he could buy her for a few moments, not a problem. So he starts swimming towards her, but he says this in his book, A Green Stick, The Chronicle of Wasted Years. He said, as I was swimming towards her, my heart was pounding within me, and something in my heart kept saying, don't, don't, don't. But he said, I was so captive to this kind of thing, I was driven to do it. And as he hurried along with every stroke moving towards her, the woman in the other end, probably terrified as to what she saw happening, someone invading her own privacy, and possibly as she saw him closer, much more stunned that this was someone from a foreign land. He says he came closer to her, and as he knew she was standing half beneath the waters, he emerged a couple of feet in front of her, shook his head, all the water off his face. He said, I was stunned when I saw what I did. She raised her arms to cover her body, and I realized I was looking into the face of a leper. The digital's gone. The feature's all gone, eroded by this neurological disease. He said, and as I looked at her, the first thought that came into my mind was, what a lecherous woman. And I had to pause and realize, no, the woman wasn't lecherous, but it was me who was living with a lecherous heart. This reality of a lecherous heart, this reality of being so alienated from God, to be trapped by the things of this world. You see, the worst effect of sin is manifested not in pain or suffering or bodily defacement, but in the discrowned faculties, the unworthy loves, the brutalized and the enslaved spirit. It's not revealed in pain and suffering and bodily defacement, but in this discrowning of our thinking, the unworthy loves, the brutalized and the enslaved spirit. My colleague Matt, who travels with me everywhere, will support this story I'm telling you just in the first hand of meeting this man. I was in Australia a few months ago. And a handsome-looking man had asked if he could meet with me for a little while. The only reason I stress his looks is because of a certain tragedy that came into his life. He'd written me a letter, but I'd forgotten the details, and he just asked if he could see me. And after reading the letter, I set it up, but it was months before, and to be honest, I'd forgotten the story. And so we meet up, nice-looking gentleman, well attired, sits across the table, and I said to him, how are you doing? He said, well, lucky to be alive. I thought that's an odd response. I said, why? He said, well, you know my story, don't you? I said, yes, you wrote it to me, but please refresh me because it's been so long. He reminded me he was a prostitute in Hollywood. He catered to men and women in their sexual desires every night. Every night. Till he contracted AIDS. And the thing that I remember most is as he sat across the table, he said this to me. He said, you know, Ravi, night after night, about 3 o'clock, I'd come back to my room and I'd lie, put my head on the pillow, and there'd be tears running down the side of my face. And I'd say to myself, why? What am I doing? Why am I doing this? Intellectually, he knew he was being utterly self-destructive. But his will was in chains. He was handcuffed. He was handcuffed. And so, ladies and gentlemen, as I talk to you about the temptation that comes to the intellect, the first reality is that we'd better realize our problem is not physical. Our problem is deeply, deeply soulish. It's spiritual. Why do I say this? The seduction of many in modern-day Christendom has been to yield to this temptation. And what has it brought forth? The so-called prosperity gospel, which has bought into materialism. So the first temptation is still very much with us, yielding to materialism. Let me take a pause here and introduce 2 Kings 5. Here's the story. Please try and string these together. The story was told of Naaman, the Syrian who had leprosy, who came to Elisha to be healed of his leprosy. Elisha looks at him, doesn't even go to see him. He tells the servant, you go and tell him to go and dip in the river Jordan 7 times, and the miracle will take place. Naaman's response, he's incensed because he's got all of his badges on him. He is dominating this country, and this little prophet in this tiny little town won't even pay him the courtesy of coming and seeing him and telling him to go and dip in their river 7 times. So he looks at him and he says, why is he asking me to do it here in Jordan? Can't I do it in Abana and Pharpar, the 2 rivers of Damascus? He's about to get outraged when one of his servants says to him, sir, if he'd asked you to do something difficult, would you have done it? He said, yeah. He said, then just go and do this. It's very simple. Dip in the river 7 times, and when you come up the 7th time, if you don't have leprosy, we can go and pay Elisha a visit. Can you imagine? He's going 1, 2, and by the 6th time, he's probably saying, I'm going to be like an absolute fool when I come out of here. He comes up the 7th time, and the leprosy is gone. What is his first response? How do I pay for this? How do I pay for this? And he says, take whatever you want to Elisha. Elisha says, you don't owe me anything. You don't owe me anything. Just go and give God the glory and worship God. His servant Gehazi is watching this, and he says, why did he let him get away lightly? And he goes and follows and tells Naaman a lie. He says, some young prophets have come to study under my master. This is not for me, this is for them. Could you give some gold and silver and clothing and all of that? So he stacks up his donkeys, takes all the stuff, goes and deposits in his room, and comes back looking totally innocent into Elisha's presence. Elisha says, where were you? He says, nowhere in particular. I have children. I knew when I asked them where they were, if they say nowhere in particular, I had better find out where they were in general. Elisha finds out, and he says, you know, the leprosy that was his is now yours. First problem, Naaman, he's willing to go God's way if God goes his. Second problem, Gehazi, he goes his own way and makes it look like God's. There you have it. The world says we'll do it if God will go our way. God says, no, you can't do that. And then when we come to start following him, we go the way of the world, only make it look like God's. Jesus says, be gone. It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the God. Second comes to the will. Why don't you jump and see if God will honor his word and protect you? So the first comes to the intellect. Second comes to the volition, to the will. Test God. Why don't you do it? And Jesus says, no, it is also written. Now this time it is fascinating. The devil makes a right assumption because he quotes the scripture, but he takes a text and puts it out of context. And Jesus says, no, it is also written, you shall not tempt the Lord your God. And he tells him to be gone. What would have happened if Jesus had yielded? You know what would have happened? The most purposeful thing for which he came would have been lost, because the devil didn't give up here. He came to him once more. If thou be the Christ, save thyself and us. He wanted to derail him from the way of the cross. I'm going to take a few minutes to talk to you about something that is very dear to my heart. I'm a Christian apologist. I present answers to people's questions and clarify truth claims. But I want you to know I'm not an intellectual. I hate being thrown into this arena. I've just been thrust into it, almost dragged into it, kicking and screaming. I tell you the truth. We go there occasion after occasion after occasion, and we get older in the room waiting for every open forum because of the tension with which we live. I was at UCLA recently. 3,000 were there half an hour before the doors were opening. They were lined up. Clemson University, 9,000 on a Thursday night. Princeton, packed. All of these universities, one after another, packed. And you're sitting alone in that room there, terrified of what's going to come at you in terms of cannonball fire. And you know, apart from the Spirit of God and the power of God, you daren't go out there. You're going to make a fool of yourself. Ask any apologist. Some of you are here, you know. My brother Dan from Kuala Lumpur, dear friend, stands in daunting situations. They're not user-friendly. But there's one thing I want to say to you, which is staggering. After all the bushes are cleared, after all of the intellectual jargon has been moved out of the way, after all of the smoke screens have been thrown up, and all of this verbiage strung together to see if they can trip you up, I'll tell you when it is in every forum that they're sitting at the edge of their seats listening. I'll switch arenas and give it to you in an anecdote form. A couple of years ago, I had the privilege, maybe a little longer than that, I did that last year too, the United Nations Prayer Breakfast. It's a tough setting because all worldviews are represented, people from high power. They give you about 20, 25 minutes max in an early morning hours to speak, and you have to be very careful walking on eggshells, as it were. And they asked me to speak on looking for absolutes in a relativistic age. So I don't know how to do it. So I took most of the time talking of the search for absolutes in 4 areas: evil, justice, love, and forgiveness. You want to define evil. You want to define justice. You want to define love. And when you blow it, you want to understand a legitimate way of being forgiven. And they're listening. You're all listening. Evil, justice, love, and forgiveness. Here we're looking for absolutes. I said, I want to tell you now the one place in the world where it is found. I said, are you ready? And they were leaning forward, sitting in their seats. I said, the one place in the world where these four converge is on a hill called Calvary. Where you see evil in the heart of man expressed, the justice of God, the Father, love poured out through His Son, forgiveness, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. When I was over, the ambassadors were lined up, and one of the ambassadors from an atheist country looked at me and he says, Dr. Zacharias, I come from an atheistic country. I don't like being here. I miss my family, but my president asked me to come. I wondered why? Today I have my answer. I came here to find God. You know what is the heart of your message and mine and discipleship? It's the cross. It's the cross. I sometimes think about the cross and shut my eyes and try to see the cruel nails, the crown of thorns, and Jesus crucified for me. But even could I see Him die, I would but see a little part of that great love which like a fire is always burning it was always burning in His heart. What language shall I borrow to thank you, dearest friend, for this thy dying sorrow? It was the famed psychologist Hobart Maurer, one-time professor at Johns Hopkins, one-time professor at Harvard, who committed suicide when he was 75 years old. He wrote an article in the American Psychologist, and to you as counselors, I think it'll be extraordinary if you haven't heard this statement from him. He wrote an article in 1960, sometime before he took his own life. He called it Sin, the Lesser of Two Evils. And here's what he said. For several decades, we psychologists have looked upon the whole matter of sin and moral accountability as a great incubus, and we've acclaimed our liberation from sin as epoch-making. But at length we have discovered that to be free from sin, that is to have the excuse of being sick rather than being sinful, is to also court the danger of becoming lost. This danger is, I believe, betokened by the widespread interest in existentialism which we are presently witnessing. In becoming amoral, ethically neutral, and free, we have cut the very roots of our being, lost our deepest sense of selfhood and identity, and with neurotics themselves now find ourselves asking, who am I, what is my deepest destiny, and what does living really mean? And then he quotes the Anna Russell psychiatric folk song. At 3 I had a feeling of ambivalence towards my brothers, and so it followed naturally, I poisoned all my lovers. But now I'm happy I have learned the lesson this has taught, that everything I do that's wrong is someone else's fault. You know what Hobart Maurer said when he wrote that article? Sin, the lesser of two evils? He said he got more adversarial and hostile mail from his contemporaries in the discipline of psychology, wondering if he too had now succumbed to this idea of sin, rather than just dealing with some kind of a naturalistic horizontal theory of psychological maladjustment. It is true, when you look at your heart, and I look at mine, the dark designs that often stalk us. I'll never forget in the 1980s, when I was relatively early in my ministry, I'd been invited to speak at some of the universities of Poland. This was still in the days of the Cold War. And on a given morning, my host, who was a medical doctor, asked me if I'd want to go to Auschwitz and spend a morning there. I said, you know, I've seen Buchenwald and Dachau. He said, no, they are concentration camps. This is a death camp. I think you ought to come with me. And so we took that long drive from Warsaw to Auschwitz. It was a cold, foggy day. I wasn't emotionally prepared for what I was going to see. Till this very day, I can tell you it made a profound, life-changing impact upon my own thinking. As we walked in and began to go from room to room and see the horrors of what was orchestrated there, where they were being slaughtered at the rate of 12,000 every day. I walked into one room and saw 14,000 pounds of women's hair stashed behind glass, where the women had been scalped before they were taken into the gas ovens. And that hair was then taken and woven into some sacks and sold in the marketplace. And as I went from room to room, it was getting quieter and quieter with a handful of us. Nothing was being said. Till you walk into the room with the children's paraphernalia and little suitcases and little toothbrushes and little clothes. And you look at a picture of two boys castrated by Joseph Mengele, standing just staring in with a hollowness in their eyes that revealed what had been done to them. And just before the gas ovens, there was a sign there, the words of Adolf Hitler, I want to raise a generation of young people devoid of a conscience, imperious, relentless, and cruel. I remember walking away from there, and Henrik, my host, saw the emotional trauma that I'd gone through. We didn't say very much on the drive back. And you know, the tragedy of what happened there is that it came through the medium of what was at that point one of the most educated nations in the world. And it came through men and women who were described in their biographies as ordinary people. See, the human heart is capable of despicable depths, your heart and mine. No matter who we are. And Jesus described it so accurately, so correctly. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. These three sum it all up. He described our condition. But secondly, he provided for our malady. You can go through the pages of any worldview and any religion. I'll guarantee you something. You will never find what you will find in the pages of the Gospels. In every religious worldview, you pay. In Buddhism, you pay. In Hinduism, you pay. The whole cyclical world of karma. In Islam, you pay. You ask any devout Muslim, how do you hope to gain entrance into paradise? His answer will be very straightforward to you. I'm not making a caricature of this. This is legitimate, authentic Islamic doctrine, that your good deeds will have to outweigh your bad deeds. And when those good deeds outweigh your bad deeds, you make your entrance into paradise. And the metaphor of that paradise is in sensual terms. I know a man from Iraq who told me that when he walked to the mosque on Fridays, he would determine which mosque he went to based upon how miserable a week he'd had in his behavior. The worse he'd been through the week, he'd go to a farther away mosque and count the number of steps he was taking so that his good deeds would outweigh his bad deeds. I remember some years ago being asked to speak at the United Nations at their prayer breakfast, and they wanted me to speak on the search for absolutes in a relativistic age. It's tough at any hour of the day, leave alone early in the morning. And because of the nature of the setting, you're only given a handful of minutes, 18 to 20 minutes, and that's understandable. But what's even more daunting is that there's a plurality of worldviews out there. So you have to be very careful how you even approach the gospel. So my approach has always been take about 18 minutes to talk about something with which you'll find the common ground, and take the last 5 to 7 to bring the gospel into it. So I said, what absolutes are you looking for? What areas? You're looking for an absolute to define evil. You talk about evil empires here, which means you must have a definition for evil. You talk about justice. You have to be able to define what justice is and find an ontic point of reference for true justice. And you have left your families and your home and you love them, but in your heart you're tempted and you want to honor the dictates of love and the demands of love. You need an absolute. Evil, justice, love. And I said, sometimes you're going to blow it big time, and you're going to come to your mates to ask for pardon, forgiveness. What is the basis on which you even can be forgiven? Evil, justice, love, and forgiveness. I said, ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you this question? Do you know where in the world these four converged on a given day? It was on a hill called Calvary, when evil, justice, love, and forgiveness came together in that historic moment of the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, let me take you to an incredible conversation. You as counselors know this better. There are times when the headwinds are so strong in the situation you find yourself in, and desperately at that moment you're crying out to God for what? For wisdom. To take you beyond learning, to take you beyond understanding. You want the right word, you want to touch the right nerve, you want to bring healing. And so it is with us as evangelists or apologists who stand in front of hostile situations. I had one such that I'll never forget. It was just a few years ago. As a guest of the Archbishop of Canterbury, 5 of us were invited because of him to go and talk to the antagonists in Israel. We were dealing with the Israeli leaders and we were dealing with the Palestinian leaders, mainly the religious leaders. And on the last day, we were in the home of one of the 4 founders of Hamas. His name was Sheikh Talal. He had been in prison for 18 years, lost some of his children in suicide bombings, and the Archbishop led the talk, and the dialogue was going on. It was getting very intense. The room was full, and smoke just filling that room. After a big lunch, we begun the discussion. Finally, the Archbishop looked at the others of us and said, can each one of you just ask one question, keep it brief, and let's see what his answer is to you. Because it was a private setting, I won't tell you the question I asked. I asked a question, and Sheikh Talal answered it. I said, Sheikh, I really don't like your answer. I said, you and I may never see each other again. I don't like your answer. I said, can I just say one thing to you, sir? And I hope you'll bear with me. I said, 5,000 years ago on a mountain not far from here, a man called Abraham took his son up the mountain to offer him as an expression of his faith. You remember that story? He said, yes. I said, let's not argue about which son right now. I said, but he took his son up that mountain. And as the axe is about to come down, God stops that arm and he says, stop. He said, that's right. I said, what did God say? He just stared at me. I said, God said, stop. I myself will provide. He said, that's right. I said, Sheikh, we're here in Ramallah. Very close to us is a hill. 2,000 years ago, God kept that promise. This time he took his own son up that hill. And this time the axe did not stop. I said, Sheikh Talal, until you and I receive the son God has provided, we'll be offering our own sons and daughters on the battlefields of this world for position and land and power and prestige. He looked at me. There was such a stunned silence in the room. And you know what, folks? I'd never thought of that before. What I'd said just came on the spur of the moment. And I thought, brother, I've really blown it. The Archbishop said, I think it's time for us to go back now. So we started to walk towards the stairways, and I was just in the body or out of the body, I couldn't tell. And the Archbishop put his arm around me and he said, Ravi, that was of God. I said, I sure hope so. We went down and the Sheikh Talal, followed the Archbishop because he was the guest of honor. And so I was hurriedly making my way towards our jeep. And the Sheikh hurriedly put the Archbishop in his and came running towards mine. I said, that's it. I'm going to be there. He's a big, solid guy. He could have had me for lunch that day. He just twirled me around. And I have 2 metal rods in my back. I thought, brother, this is it. He twirled me around, put his hand on my shoulder, stared at me. And I looked back. Then he patted me on both sides of the face, kissed me on both sides of the face. He said, Mr. Zacharias, you're a good man. He said, I hope someday I see you again. And you could just see the eyes welling up with tears. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been a proclaimer of the gospel for 42 years now. I came to know Jesus Christ on a bed of suicide at the age of 17 in Delhi. And the longer I've walked with my Lord, I have got a deeper and deeper conviction that this combination of grace, love, forgiveness, and redemption is the marvelous truth of the gospel that the world so desperately needs. Desperately needs. His description of my condition, his provision for my malady. Thirdly, his strength in my suffering. Remember Annie Johnston Flint, who was orphaned, arthritic, cancerous, blind, incontinent, lay in bed with 8 pillows cushioning the boils on her body for being in bed so long, for so many years. She writes, He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength when the labors increase. To added affliction he addeth his mercy. To multiplied trials his multiplied peace. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, when our strength has failed ere the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving has only begun. His love has no limit, His grace has no measure. His power has no boundaries known unto men. For out of his infinite riches in Jesus, he giveth and giveth and giveth again. The Lord who gives succor, sustenance, internal strength, and takes you through the dark nights of the soul. His strength is made perfect in our weakness. No time to expand, but let me just read this for you hurriedly. What James Stewart said is this: it is a glorious phrase that he led captivity captive. The very triumphs of his foes it means he used for their defeat. He compelled their dark achievements to subserve his ends, not theirs. They nailed him to the tree, not knowing that by that very act they were bringing the world to his feet. They gave him a cross, not guessing that he would make it a throne. They flung him outside the gates to die, not knowing that in that very moment they were lifting up all the gates of the universe to let the King of Glory come in. They thought to root out his doctrines, not understanding that they were implanting imperishably in the hearts of men the very name they intended to destroy. They thought they had God with his back to the wall, pinned and helpless and defeated. They did not know that it was God himself who had tracked them down to that point. He did not conquer in spite of the dark mystery of evil. He conquered through it. The description of your heart, the provision for your malady, the sustenance in your suffering, and lastly, the hope that he gives beyond the grave. When my mother passed away, I couldn't help but think of just one word: she was gone. I was in my 20s when we lost her. Gone, gone. Till my dad asked me to complete the thought, gone where? And on my knees it came so comfortingly. My mother had not just gone, she'd gone home to be with her heavenly Father. She was a late comer to Christ. 3 conversions after the resurrection: Saul of Tarsus to Paul, doubting Thomas to the evangelist to India, James the brother of Jesus, so powerful in their testimonies to the resurrection of Jesus that changed history. Hope beyond the grave, and hope for now. My time's gone, so let me just close, because I began with there's nothing like him in history. Malcolm Muggeridge said this, and with this I close. Give me your undivided attention. It'll take me 2 minutes or so to say it. He said, we look back upon history and what do we see? Empires rising and falling, revolutions and counter-revolutions, wealth accumulated and wealth dispersed. Shakespeare has spoken of the rise and fall of great ones that ebb and flow with the moon. I look back upon my own fellow countrymen in England, once upon a time dominating a quarter of the world, most of them convinced, in the words of what is still a popular song, that the God who made them mighty shall make them mightier yet. I've heard a crazed, cracked Austrian announce to the world the establishment of a Reich that would last 1,000 years. I've seen an Italian clown saying he was going to stop and restart the calendar with his own ascension to power. I met a murderous Georgian brigand in the Kremlin, acclaimed by the intellectual elite of the world as a wiser than Solomon, more humane than Marcus Aurelius, more enlightened than Ashoka. I have seen America wealthier, and in terms of military weaponry, had the American people so desired, they could outdone a Caesar or an Alexander in the range and scale of their conquest, all in one lifetime. All in one lifetime. All gone. Gone with the wind. England, part of a tiny island off the coast of Europe, threatened with dismemberment and even bankruptcy. Hitler and Mussolini dead, remembered only in infamy. Stalin, a forbidden name in the regime he helped found and dominate for some 3 decades. America haunted by the fears of running out of those precious fluids that keep some motorways roaring and the smog settling, with troubled memories of a disastrous campaign in Vietnam and the victory of the Don Quixotes of the media as they charged the windmills of Watergate. All in one lifetime. All in one lifetime. As the challenge was given to them and they were sought out to be remolded and reshaped, take a notice of what happened. These men were in exile, and all of a sudden the highest man in the land is asking for the best of these young men to be selected. Strong in their countenance, impressive in their personality, And what was it that was going to take place? They were to be reprogrammed and a new set of values planted within them. They were to be taught the philosophy, the literature, and the language of the Babylonians. Philosophy, the way they reason, and the entire change of culture could begin once that language was handed to them. The philosophy, literature, and language to help these men rethink all that there was to be challenging them within this new culture, so that a new set of values would be born into them and then transferred through them to the next generation. The Bible says this, "But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. He asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, 'I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you.'" He goes on to show how Daniel reasoned with him. And then in verse 17, "To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service in every matter of wisdom and understanding, about which the king questioned them. He found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters of his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus." Percy Bysshe Shelley, the great poet, penned these words, which we are almost seeing unfold even to this very day. He said, "I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 'Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that the sculptor well those passions read, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed, which yet survive stamped on these lifeless things. And on the pedestal these words appear, My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains round that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains round that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. You can go to the Middle East today and see the broken statues of one-time demagogues, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that the sculptor well those passions read. They come and go. They stand with an authoritarianism, a demagogic splendor given to themselves. And all of a sudden rebellion comes. As they're overthrown, you just see them somewhere in desert terrain. It's one side of the picture. And there's another side of it. Who are the ones who can dare stand before them with the conviction of God's truth and reaching out with a love that God alone is big enough to plant in a heart like that? I just returned from the former Soviet Union in Moscow. Came back 2 days ago. About to leave in 2 days from now to China. And I look at all that those nations represent in demagogues and how they have stood individuals before them who've changed history. In the year 2000, Russia started to release its political prisoners. In the midst of them was a man called Andres Tamas, who had been incarcerated for 55 years. He was a Hungarian. He was talking gibberish. And finally somebody said, execute him, he is of no use to anyone. But somebody said, at least bring in a psychiatrist to examine him before you choose to execute him. So they went and brought a Hungarian psychiatrist. He stayed with Thomas for a few days, and he came out and said, you know what? He's not insane. He's not talking gibberish. He's talking an old Hungarian dialect. You have nearly driven him insane. You brought him in here when he was 20. He has now lived in near solitary confinement for over 50 years. Give him back to us. We will make him well. Andres Thomas was put into a wheelchair and being taken out. What do you think was the first request he made? If you have not heard the story, the first request he made was for a mirror. He had not seen a mirror since the age of 20. He looked into the mirror for a fraction of a moment and then turned it away, buried his face in his hands and sobbed uncontrollably. What do you think it would be like for over half a century not to look at your own reflection in some way? You start off in the robust virility of youth, and now you're a wizened old man looking at all that time has extracted and exacted from you. You know, we take for granted a mirror. We get up every morning, do our necessary ablutions, put on innocent forms of disfigurement, and we walk out of there to look like what we wished we did. And yet when you come back from a long journey, you realize you actually resemble your passport picture much more than you resemble anything else. It's true. Is there a mirror for the soul? Is there a reflection that you can glean, that you can gain of what God intended for you and me to look like, to stand before the powers of our time? And how best is a life like that framed? I want to take you tonight to look at one man like that. His name was Daniel, and he knew where to draw the lines. And to those of you about to graduate, on the eve of that graduation, you're drawing one line today. You're crossing over all the discipline of study that you've poured in, and all of the long hours are bringing you this reward of walking away from here with learning, understanding, experience, encountering mentors, and a certificate to remind you what you accomplished during this time. I wanted to talk to you a little bit tonight about the 3 lines that will be important for you to draw as you proceed from here. And you will learn from Daniel how he marched to a different drummer, the lines that he drew that helped him become a world changer. The first is this: he drew the line of resistance by training his appetite. He trained his hungers. There was nothing wrong with eating at the king's table. He could have had a banquet night after night, day after day, and enjoyed it. After all, he could have seen it as God's provision for him. We move towards the direction of our comfort. We do. But the important thing is how God reminds us never to get so comfortable with comforts that it is the comfort principle that ends up driving all that you do. Here is a man who trained his appetite, training his longings, training his hungers. And the marvelous thing is this: how he reminded himself again and again that he did not want to get spoiled by all that the king would afford to him and give to him. Instead, he disciplined himself and backed away from even that which could have been all right for him to enjoy, but he resisted it for a greater and a higher call. I want to talk to you a little bit about training your hungers. The truth of the matter is that we make small decisions in the early days of our lives that often can put some deep desires within us that are not good for the long run and the long haul. I remember some years ago when I got a telephone call at 11 o'clock at night. My worldview changes after 9 p.m. I'm an early to bed guy. By 9 p.m. I don't want to discuss anything serious with anybody. I'd rather do it at 4 or 5 in the morning than after 9 p.m. So if anybody calls me after 9 or 9:30, I assume it's pretty urgent. I recognized the voice, and he said, "Ravi, you awake?" I said, "Not really. I was awakened by this telephone." He said, "Can I talk to you?" I said, yes. He said, I want you to pray for me. I'm in trouble. I'm in serious trouble. This man was a medical doctor. He functioned in the emergency room. He said, tonight they brought a young woman in, so badly beaten, so brutalized, almost every major bone in her body was broken. And as she was wheeled in by the paramedics, they said, Doc, she's too far gone. There's nothing you can do. He said, I looked at her battered body and I thought, this can't be it. I'm going to do my best to rescue her. He said, I got scrubbed, called my team around me, and he said, the only hope I had was to give a direct heart massage. I slit the side of the rib cage, put my hand into that chest cavity so that I could hold the heart in my hand and keep pumping it to see if I could get some life back there. He said, just turned like blubber into my hands. And he said, I walked away from there and I thought, what happened? Who did this to her? What was it all about? He said, I was washing my hands literally with my eyes filled with tears. And the nurse comes with a bag full of paraphernalia, empties it onto a table, and she says, Doc, you better take a look at this. It was all drug-related stuff, used needles and all the junk that was in that bag. He said, as I was looking at that, I was wiping my hands dry when I noticed, he said, I had nicked my finger when I put my hand into the rib cage. He said, I've cut myself and I have made contact with terribly diseased blood. And he said, I'm a young father. I want you to pray for me. I said, is the cut deep? He said, no, it's about a paper-thin cut. I said, you're telling me that a paper-thin cut like this could put you in jeopardy for a disease that would take away all of your resistance to any other disease? He said, it doesn't take anything more than that. It doesn't take anything more than that. And I thought when I hung up and woke up the next morning reflecting on it, the first thought that came to my mind, first thought, can we put paper cuts to our soul early in life? Can we entertain a habit? Can we begin a relationship? Can we make a choice? Could it be one evening that lacerates you in such a way that puts a different kind of hunger into you and the destruction process can set in? To you young men especially, I want to give you this challenge. There are people out there with businesses and productions and ideas whose sole purpose is to cut you in your soul and get you hooked and reprogrammed so that you will then have hungers and passions and desires that no one human being on the face of the earth can ever fulfill. All they end up doing is framing your mind and creating within you a kind of imagination that is ultimately insatiable, never ever satisfied. In this day of mass communication with computers and so on, we are living with a great deal of danger for our young people. I remember talking slightly about this on one occasion in a university, in a seminary setting in Midwestern Canada. I just mentioned this whole scourge of the pornographic empire. And at the end, when the invitation was given, every aisle in that auditorium was filled with kneeling men, tears running down their faces, wanting to retrain their hungers. My daughter had the privilege of coming here and speaking. Naomi, she works in the rescue of women and children from the prostitution industry. She's been pleading with me to write a book with her on pornography. She says, Dad, if I could only tell you the devastation this thing wreaks. And I have fought it off and fought it off and fought it off because I hate to even get into the research of something like this. Graduates, draw the line in the right places so that you can train your hungers. The second thing was he drew his line of resistance by training his appetite, but he drew also his line of dependence. What is that dependence? To go beyond the reading, to go beyond the learning, to seek wisdom. You see, Nebuchadnezzar did an extraordinary thing. He had this dream again and again. It was a culture in which dreams and visions meant an awful lot. And this repeated dream of a statue with a head and shoulders of gold, the breast as it were of silver, the girth made of bronze, the legs made of iron, and the feet of a mixture of iron and clay. And a stone cut out of no man's hand smashes that statue. And he wants to know what this means, what it all means. And so the magicians and the enchanters, very clever, they came one day and said, we will be able to interpret for you because you're threatening our lives otherwise. Just tell us the dream and we will interpret it. He said, not so quick, boys. You tell me the dream as well if you're that capable. And then you interpret it. You know, I grew up in India where we had these palmists and astrologers always telling us our future. I will never forget my mother bringing in one of these palmists to read the palms of my older brother, my two sisters, my younger brother, 5 of us. And he's going around looking at each one of the palm and giving them all these glorious future predictions. Then he holds mine in his hand and he looks at it and he goes, and my mother is standing there. I said, that's it. I'm being confirmed as a loser. And then he looks at me and he says, Ravi Baba, which is Ravi little boy. And then in Hindi he says to me, you're not going to travel at all in your life. You're going to be stuck right here. It was on a day where everybody wanted to go abroad. All I can say to you now is I hope I meet up with him someday. Because the only possible career for him is weather reporting. Because it's the only one where you can make so many mistakes and still have millions view you in living color and you still claim to your degrees. I'm never going to travel very much. The enchanters and magicians were like that, and Nebuchadnezzar says, no, you tell me what the dream is. So they're all going to have their heads lopped off. Saddam Hussein avowedly stated he wanted to build his empire like that of Nebuchadnezzar. He was patterning it after him. And so Daniel comes on the scene and he gets on his knees and he says, God, we're in trouble. I don't have the learning. I don't have the knowledge. I don't have the books. Only you are able to tell me what the dream was. And God reveals it to him. It's a tough dream to talk to about Nebuchadnezzar. He goes and looks at Nebuchadnezzar and says, I want to tell you something. That which I'm about to tell you has nothing to do with my learning. It has nothing to do with my education. It has nothing to do with my intellect. It has everything to do with God's wisdom. And now I will unfold to you your dream. You can only learn so much from books. You can only learn so much from education. Ultimately, that which will carry you through will be the wisdom of God in the toughest situations of life. I remember a few years ago, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, George Carey, asked 5 of us men to go with him to meet with the Israeli and the Palestinian leaders to try and bring them together. We'd worked hard for several days. We were exhausted. And that afternoon, they'd gone to see Yasser Arafat. I backed out of that. I just didn't feel it was right. I felt we were going to be used by him. As it turned out, it was right. That's on an aside. The last one we met with was Sheikh Talal, one of the 4 founders of Hamas. And he was a powerfully built man. Room filled with them puffing tobacco and so on. Served us a great meal. He'd spent 18 years in prison. He'd lost some of his children in suicide bombers. Archbishop Carey led in the talk, bringing him to a point, and then it was getting close to leaving time. He gave each one of us 5-minute chance to ask him one question. I asked him mine. I won't tell you what it was. It was a very private setting. But I didn't like his answer. Finally looked at him. I said, Sheikh Talal, you and I may never meet again. But I don't like your answer, sir, and I want to tell you something. So not far from where you and I are sitting, there's a mountain. 5,000 years ago, a man by the name of Abraham climbed up that mountain to offer his son as a sacrifice. Remember that? He said, yes. I said, let's not argue about which son it was. Let's just agree it was his son. He said, yes. I said, Abraham takes this boy up, and the axe is about to come down, and God stops that arm. He says, that's right. I said, what did God say? And he just stared at me. I said, you know what God said? God said, stop. I, myself, will provide. He said, that's right. I said, very close to where you and I are sitting, Sheikh Talal, 2,000 years ago, God kept that promise. And he took his own son up that hill. And this time the axe did not stop. He just kept staring at me. I said, Sheikh, until you and I receive the Son God has provided for you and me, we will be offering our own sons and daughters on the battlefields of this world for position, power, land, and prestige. There was such an obvious silence in the room. And the Archbishop said, I think it's time for us to go. I said, brother, I've blown it. I was walking up towards the stairs where we were to head down. And the Archbishop came around me and put his arm around me and he said, Ravi, that was of God. I said, I sure hope so.